His conscience challenges him to explain what has brought him to this ending of his life. Why is he in Korea? Who is his enemy? By what rationale has he killed others so far away from home? Can he really expect to avoid responsibility for his actions by claiming that he was ordered there by his government and merely did what those in command told him to do? In this dying man's dialogue with his conscience, he finally comes to see the nature of moral responsibility, the fallacy in trying to make over other parts of the world in his own government's image, and the irrationality of using collectivist and statist methods to oppose collectivism in other parts of the globe. As the last flicker of life leaves his body, this dying soldier says to himself, "Why did I not think of these ideas and their meaning? Why did I not think?" When Leonard Read wrote Conscience on the Battlefield in early 1951, Americans were not yet war-weary over the conflict in Korea. U.S. forces had only just been pushed back to the 38th parallel by Chinese communist armies after what had seemed like the successful liberation of North Korea just a few months earlier under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur. Leonard Read and the Foundation for Economic Education came in for significant criticism from many of its supporters for publishing this pamphlet. The criticism and loss of financial support only increased after Fee published another pamphlet, also in 1951, this one entitled In Search of Peace, by another Foundation staff member, F.A. Harper, who went on 10 years later to found the Institute for Humane Studies. Harper challenged the premises of an interventionist foreign policy and explained why foreign interventionism threatens the liberty and the prosperity of the country that sets out to make the world over through political and military force. Even in the face of the loss of donor dollars, Leonard Read and the other staff members at FEE were not willing to compromise their consciences or their principles in making the case for freedom and the warning of the dangers from American involvement in foreign wars. FEE weathered this storm, and as Brian Doherty has emphasized in his recent book, Radicals for Capitalism, for the 25 years after the end of the Second World War, FEE stood virtually alone as one of the beacons of liberty to educate and inspire a new generation of classical liberals and libertarians who then became thinkers and advocates, including Bumper and myself. The fact is that whenever war comes, one of the first results is the attempt to close off all further debate and criticism of foreign policy. It is usually said that criticisms and doubts may have been all very well and good before the conflict started. But once the battle has been joined, all must show solidarity now that our boys are in harm's way. Every real American must stand behind the government and our fighting men in the field. Nothing must be done to undermine their morale and the goal of victory, so that they may be brought home in the shortest time with the fewest casualties. My country, right or wrong, now that the nation is at war and facing unknown perils. Let me suggest, however, that at just such times, doubts and criticisms of American foreign policy are most needed. War invariably brings a lexicon and an imagery of a world divided between two parts, good and evil, right and wrong, them and us. Brutalities and cruelties committed by our side are swept under the rug or rationalized as unfortunate tragedies and inevitabilities of war. And every action by the enemy is demonized as justification for anything that we have to do to bring the war to a victorious end. War does bring in its wake terrible barbarities and cruelties. And precisely because it does so, the eye and voice of criticism must be turned on it. And not only when the battle may have been won and the conflict has passed into history. It is during the course of the war that its designers and implementers must be held accountable for their actions. While there is time to minimize, if not prevent, some of the death and destruction which goes euphemistically under the sanitized phrase collateral damage. It is also precisely during war that the citizenry must remind the government that its function is to protect the lives, liberty, and property of the people. Government must be prevented from using the cover of war and national emergency to expand its own powers of intrusion and control over the people whose freedom it is meant to guard. Ultimately, the greatest long-run threat to the freedom of any people is its own government, which possesses the legitimized right to use force and the threat of force against them in its own territory. If history has taught anything, it is that once freedoms have been lost by a people, regaining those lost freedoms from their own government is no easy task. The first duty, therefore, is to prevent those freedoms from being taken away. Thus, when war comes, no one who values freedom at home and wishes to minimize harm done to the innocent abroad should allow himself to stand mute when the flag is waved in front of him. Indeed, all who cherish what the flag was originally meant to represent must take the individual responsibility to remind their fellow citizens and their government that it is the protection of liberty and the respect for human life that must be the guide in all that the political authority presumes to do. To speak out in such a manner is the highest form of patriotism in a free society. Because it is motivated by the desire to see that even in the heat of battle and the trauma of war, we expect our own government and ourselves to act in ways consistent with the principles of liberty on which this country was originally founded. So what are we to tell our fellow Americans? Well, let me speak for myself. As an advocate of individual freedom, I consider all forms of government interference in people's lives, other than those minimally essential for the protection of life, liberty, and property, to be morally wrong, politically harmful, and economically counterproductive. As part of that political philosophy, I believe that the government of the United States should no more intervene in the internal affairs of other countries than in the personal, peaceful, and voluntary affairs of its own citizens at home. Many of our fellow Americans follow courses of action in their own lives that I consider stupid, immoral, and harmful. But I also feel strongly that it would be morally wrong and pragmatically counterproductive to force my fellow countrymen to follow the courses of action that I consider to be wiser and richer for them. Either every man must be respected and protected as a free agent in his own affairs, or we run the risk of degenerating into a society of coercing meddlers, each with his own banner of right living, each trying to use the political power of the state to make his fellow citizens bend to our own respective visions of the good, proper, and virtuous life. Society becomes a war of all against all, as individuals sharing similar conceptions of the good living form coalitions for strength in the struggle for votes, influence, and control of the state's authority to use force. But men, being what they are, even when they begin as pure at heart, true believers, only wishing to use the state for the good of others, as they conceive that good, soon are taken over by the dark side of the force. It is 30 years since the beginning of Star Wars. The wielding of power over others becomes an aphrodisiac, a high stronger than any narcotic. And besides having political power, it also has its use for material gain, both for oneself and for those with whom one is in coalition for power. Few have been able to resist these temptations over the ages. Even when the first generation of such coercing meddlers coming to power remained fairly uncorrupted by the opportunities for gain, Their heirs in acquiring the reins of political authority have tended to have fewer inhibitions in resisting these temptations.